The crimson dust storms of Kepler 442b had finally subsided, leaving behind a landscape of devastation that stretched across the northern settlements. Helen wiped the rust-colored particles from her visor as she surveyed the damage to the human colony's outer perimeter. The magnetic storms that plagued this frontier world every rotation cycle were brutal. But this one had been particularly vicious. "Helen, you need to see this." Jerry's voice crackled through her helmet communicator. Her fellow surveyor stood about 200 meters to the east, near the boundary where the Tharn settlements began. Helen trudged through the ankle-deep dust, her boots leaving temporary impressions that the wind would soon erase. As she approached, she saw what had caught Jerry's attention. A Tharn female, her forearms working frantically, was attempting to reconstruct what appeared to be a dwelling. The structure was a pathetic assembly of bent metal sheets and torn fabric, barely standing against the persistent breeze. "That's Velsha," Jerry said quietly. "Her mate died in the mining accident 6 months ago. She's been raising 3 younglings alone." Helen observed the alien mother working with desperate determination. The Tharn were an insectoid species, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming an iridescent blue-green under Kepler's orange sun. Velsha's movements were jerky, exhausted. 2 small Tharn younglings huddled behind a partially collapsed wall, their antennae drooping with fear and cold. "Where's the 3rd one?" Helen asked. Jerry pointed to a crude shelter nearby. "Sick, I think. I saw Velsha carrying it there earlier." The Tharn settlements had never been prosperous. When humans arrived on Kepler 442b 15 years ago, they'd found the Tharn already struggling on this harsh world, refugees from a war-torn system. The 2 species maintained a cautious distance, not hostile, but not exactly friendly. Different biology, different needs, different languages that translation software could barely bridge. Helen watched Velsha lift a metal beam that had to weigh at least 50 kilograms. The Tharn female's arms trembled with the effort. The beam slipped, crashing down and nearly crushing one of the younglings. Velsha made a high-pitched keening sound, grief and frustration combined. "We should get back to the colony," Jerry said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The commander won't approve any cross-species intervention. Resources are tight enough as it is." Helen knew he was right. The Colony Council had made it clear humanity first. They were barely sustaining their own population. Every kilogram of building material was accounted for, every energy credit allocated. Getting involved with the Tharn would mean requisition forms, committee reviews, and almost certain rejection. She turned away, took 3 steps, then stopped. "Fuck it," Helen muttered. "What?" I said fuck it. "Jerry, you remember that prefab shelter unit? The one that got damaged during transport? The one sitting in Storage Bay 7 because it failed inspection?" Jerry's eyes widened behind his visor. "Helen, that's colony property. We can't just... It failed inspection because one wall panel had a cosmetic dent. Everything else works perfectly. It's just sitting there, scheduled for recycling next month." Helen was already walking back toward their rover. "We could have it here in 90 minutes. The commander will have our heads. Probably." Helen climbed into the driver's seat. "You coming or not?" Jerry stood frozen for a moment, looking between the struggling alien mother and the rover. Then he shook his head with a rueful smile and climbed in beside her. "My dad always said I had a self-destructive streak." 3 hours later, they'd managed to transport not just the prefab shelter but also 2 thermal generators, a water filtration unit, and several boxes of emergency rations that technically wouldn't be noticed missing for another week. Helen had called in favors from the maintenance crew, while Jerry had distracted the supply officer with a fabricated story about seismic readings. Setting up the shelter was the easy part. The prefab units were designed for rapid deployment. The real challenge was adapting it for Tharn physiology. The doorway needed to be wider, the ceiling higher. Helen recalibrated the atmospheric processor to account for the Tharn's higher methane tolerance. Velsha had watched their arrival with suspicion, her antennae twitching nervously. When they began assembling the structure, she'd tried to intervene, clicking and whistling in rapid Tharn. The translation software rendered it roughly as "no debt possible. Obligation cannot fulfill." "No obligation," Helen had said, speaking slowly to let the translator work. "Gift, help." The concept didn't seem to translate well. Tharn culture apparently had no equivalent for charity. By the time they finished, the orange sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. The shelter stood firm and weatherproof, its thermal generators humming steadily. Inside, the sick youngling would have warmth. The water filtration unit would provide clean water for weeks. Velcia stood before the structure, her 4 arms hanging limply at her sides. Then she did something Helen had never seen a Tharn do. She knelt, lowering her thorax to the ground in what could only be a gesture of profound respect or gratitude. "No," Helen said quickly, feeling uncomfortable. She reached out and gently touched one of Velcia's upper arms. "Stand, we're neighbors." "Neighbors help," Jerry added. "We're humans, it's what we do." As they drove back to the colony, Helen knew there would be consequences. Commander Reeves would be furious. There would be disciplinary hearings, possibly demotion, maybe even criminal charges for theft of colony resources. Was it worth it? Jerry asked quietly. Helen thought about the 3 Tharn younglings who would sleep warm that night. She thought about Velcia's exhausted gratitude. She thought about what it meant to be human in a cold and different universe, the choice to extend a hand even when logic suggested otherwise. "Yeah," she said, "it was worth it." The disciplinary hearing happened 3 days later, just as Helen had predicted. What she hadn't predicted was the petition signed by 47 colony members requesting leniency, or the testimony from Dr. Martinez about human psychological health and the importance of maintaining our humanitarian values even in frontier conditions, or the surprise statement from the Tharn settlement elder, delivered through translation software, offering a trade agreement that would provide the colony with rare minerals in exchange for technical assistance. Commander Reeves had looked at Helen with something between exasperation and grudging respect. 2 weeks docked pay. And next time you want to play Interstellar Good Samaritan, at least run it by me first so I can pretend to deny permission. As Helen left the hearing room, Jerry was waiting with a grin. "Humanity, fuck yeah?" Helen laughed. "Humanity, fuck yeah." Through the settlement windows she could see the Tharn section in the distance. Velcia's new home stood among the ruins, a small beacon of stability. And beside it, other structures were beginning to rise, built with materials quietly donated from various colony departments, erected by volunteers during off-duty hours. Humans, Helen thought, might not always make the practical choice, but they'd never stopped making the right one. That's what made them human. The end.